graph we are in is the project graph. To be able to add functionality to our scene objects, we need to switch to our scene graph. But first, let's delete the node we created previously by clicking it and then pressing delete. Now let's click the tab here labelled speed meter to switch to our scene graph. Now you'll see that we have two event listener nodes already in the graph. They trigger when the scene is shown or hidden. But what if we want to be able to trigger logic manually, by pressing a key on the keyboard for example? Now let's create a console node like we did before, except this time we're going to do it a little bit differently. If you right click the graph background and then start typing console, then hit return, you can quickly add it to the graph. Now let's add another node in the same way by searching for on KeyPress. If we click on this node, we will see an attribute called key. Click the drop down box to see the available KeyPress events that we have at our disposal. Let's scroll down and select up. Now if we connect the on KeyPress node to the console node and press play, we can trigger the console message manually by pressing the up key. Now we want to be able to change the value of our speed meter, which means that we need to be able to store the speed value somewhere. In Incari and computer programming in general, these values are stored inside something called a variable, so that they can be accessed and manipulated when needed. To create a variable, let's first go over to the tabs on the left and click the bottom tab. We can then press the plus icon to add a new variable. You will then be prompted to assign a new name for a variable, which we will call value_speed. There is also a drop down for the type of data that we will be storing. There are quite a few different types to choose from, which may seem intimidating at first, but for this tutorial we will just be looking at numerical values and text. The main numerical types are int or integer, which is a whole number without a decimal place, and a float or floating point number, which can have a decimal point. There are fundamental differences between these two types, but that's not something that I will be discussing here. Because in real life speed is rarely an exact whole number, we will choose float for our purposes, and then press the add button. Now if we click on this variable, we can see it has an attribute called default value. This is where we can set the initial value that the variable will be when the scene starts. To test, let's set this to 40 and then drag it into our graph. We will then be given four options: getter, setter, onChange or onSet. We want to get the value of the variable, so let's select getter. Before we connect this up, I just want to talk about another data type. If we click on the console node, you will see that it says string under data type. This means that the value of this node is a string of characters, hello world in this case. Now let's plug this into our console node. You may notice that the data sockets on the console node changed colour. If we click on the node itself, we will see that the data type now says float. If we were to set this back to string and try and reconnect it from the console input to the speed getter, Incari would automatically create a conversion node that attempts to convert a data value from one type to another. We will come back to this later, but for now, let's just do it as before. If we now run this, we will see that pressing up logs the number 40 to the console. Back in the logic editor, let's add another node called add. Then put our speed value into the top input socket. Then click on the node itself and change its second input to the number 2. Then adjust our pulses and the connections, and then press play. Pressing up will now show in the console that the value has been raised by 2. In the next lesson, we will be moving away from the console altogether and looking at how to dynamically change the value of variables and represent values in the text object of our scene.